Glenn Schur is a farmer in the Texas Panhandle whose family has worked the same land for 3 generations. His granddad dug the well, his dad pumped the well, and Glenn is going to be the generation that caps the well. Because the water underneath his farm, the water that made the Texas Panhandle one of the most productive agricultural regions in the history of human civilization, is gone. Not running low, gone. In parts of the Texas Panhandle, the Ogallala Aquifer, the underground reservoir that irrigates 1/5 of all American cropland, has been completely drained. Vast stretches of Texas farmland that once fed millions of people no longer support irrigation. The wells are dry. The soil is turning to dust. And a University of Texas projection from 2025 indicates that up to 70% of the Texas Panhandle's agricultural land will become unusable within 20 years if current pumping rates continue. That is not a worst-case scenario from an environmental group. That is the state of Texas's own projection about its own land. And the Ogallala is just one piece of a story that most Americans have never been told in its full, devastating scope. The story is this. The United States of America, the country that fed the world for the better part of a century, the country whose agricultural output was so enormous that it served as a geopolitical weapon during the Cold War, the country that produced so much food that its biggest agricultural policy challenge for decades was managing surpluses. That country is now watching its agricultural foundation collapse from beneath it. 30 million acres of U.S. cropland have been abandoned since the 1980s, more than 1 million acres per year. Fruit production has dropped 36% in 2 decades. Farm bankruptcies are soaring. Farm debt is set to hit a record high this year. The USDA has lost 1/5 of its workforce. The government shutdown froze financial assistance to farmers during the critical harvesting and crop planting season, and 47.9 million Americans lived in food-insecure households last year. In the richest country in the history of the world, America fed everyone. Now, America goes hungry. The water that built American agriculture is disappearing, and it took thousands of years to accumulate, and it will not come back. The Ogallala Aquifer stretches from South Dakota to the Texas Panhandle across 8 states. It irrigates 13.6 million acres of American farmland. It supports $35 billion in crop production every year. It provides 20% of the nation's wheat, corn, cotton, and cattle production and accounts for 30% of all water used for irrigation in the United States. Nearly 200,000 irrigation wells pump from the aquifer, most of them installed since the 1940s. And since major groundwater pumping began, farmers have drained the equivalent of 2/3 of Lake Erie from the aquifer. 89 trillion gallons, gone. And the water that remains is being depleted at an annual volume equivalent to 18 Colorado rivers, according to Scientific American. 18 entire rivers worth of water every year pumped out of an underground reservoir that nature replenishes at a rate of roughly 1/2 inch per year, while farmers in some regions were withdrawing 4 to 6 feet per year. The math is not complicated. It is catastrophic. In Kansas, 30% of the aquifer's access points have already run dry. The state's governor acknowledged that some communities are just a generation away from running out of water entirely. The latest measurements from January 2025 show aquifer levels in southwest Kansas fell by over 1.5 feet, the largest decline in recent years. In the Texas Panhandle, the water table has been completely dewatered in some areas, meaning there is no water left to pump. In northwest Kansas, water levels dropped by 1.34 feet in a single year, far more than the previous year's decline. And within 50 years, the entire Ogallala Aquifer is expected to be 70% depleted, according to Kansas State University researchers. The region supplied by this aquifer produces 1/5 of the total annual U.S. agricultural harvest. If the aquifer goes dry, more than $20 billion worth of food and fiber vanishes from world markets. And the water took thousands of years to accumulate in the geological formations beneath the Great Plains. Hundreds to thousands of years of rainfall would be needed to replace the groundwater that has been depleted. There is no engineering solution that operates on that timescale. There is no pipeline from the Great Lakes that could fill the aquifer. There is no desalination plant that could replace 18 Colorado rivers per year. The water is going, And when it is gone, the farmland above it reverts to dry land agriculture, which produces a fraction of the yield, or it reverts to dust, which produces nothing. And the families that farm that land for 3 generations will cap their wells and leave. And the communities that were built around those farms will follow. And the Ogallala is not the only aquifer in crisis. The Central Valley Aquifer in California, which supplies water to the region that produces approximately 25% of America's food, has been declining for decades. Land in parts of the San Joaquin Valley has sunk more than 28 feet because the ground itself is compacting as the water beneath it is pumped out. Once the ground compacts, the aquifer's storage capacity is permanently reduced. The water that was there can never be replaced because the geological space it occupied no longer exists. In Arizona, the Colorado River allocation that supports farming in the state has been cut repeatedly as the river's flow declines from drought and over-allocation. Farmers in Pinal County, Arizona, who grew cotton, alfalfa, and other crops for generations have been fallowing their fields because the water is simply not available. And in the Midwest, nitrate contamination from agricultural runoff is rendering groundwater unsafe to drink in an expanding number of rural communities, forcing residents to buy bottled water or install expensive filtration systems while the underlying contamination continues to spread. The water crisis in American agriculture is not one crisis. It is dozens of simultaneous crises in every major agricultural region in the country, each driven by the same fundamental dynamic. Water that took centuries or millennia to accumulate is being consumed in decades, and no technology, no policy, and no amount of money can put it back on a human timescale. 30 million acres of American cropland have been abandoned, and fruit production has collapsed by 36% in 2 decades. Research published by multiple institutions documents that approximately 30 million acres of U.S. cropland have been abandoned since the 1980s, with land going out of production at over 1 million acres per year between 1986 and 2018. 1 million acres per year. That is an area larger than Rhode Island disappearing from agricultural production every single year for more than 3 decades. And the land is not being abandoned because farmers chose to retire early or because a better opportunity came along. The land is being abandoned because the water ran out, because the soil degraded, because the input costs exceeded the commodity prices, because the property taxes made the land more valuable as a housing development than as a farm, because the farmers' children moved to the city and nobody was left to work the land. The USDA reports that fruit production in the United States has dropped by a staggering 36% over the past 2 decades. Vegetable production has decreased by over 6%. Those are not temporary fluctuations caused by a bad growing season. Those are structural declines driven by the economics of farming. Carolina Farm Trust documented that fruit and vegetable farming is extremely difficult, that produce spoils quickly requiring costly logistics and labor-intensive handling, and that small-scale operations face immense challenges including perishability, labor costs, and market access. The United States is now importing an increasing share of the fruits and vegetables that Americans eat. And the food import bill is climbing every year because the domestic production base that once made America the world's breadbasket is shrinking. The country that exported food to the world is importing food from Mexico, Chile, Peru, China, and dozens of other countries because it can no longer grow enough of it domestically. And every food import is a vulnerability. Every container of tomatoes from Mexico depends on a trade relationship that tariffs can disrupt overnight. Every shipment of fruit from Chile depends on a shipping lane that a geopolitical crisis can close. Every food product that America used to grow for itself and now imports from abroad is a link in a chain that can break at any of a dozen points, leaving American grocery stores with shelves that are sparser, more expensive, and less resilient than they have been at any point in the country's modern history. And the cattle herd tells the same story from the livestock side. The U.S. cattle herd has shrunk to levels not seen since the early 1960s. Drought across the southern plains forced ranchers to cull breeding stock because there was not enough grass or water to keep them alive. When you cull breeding stock, you are not just reducing this year's production. You are reducing next year's and the year after because breeding animals produce the next generation, and it takes 2 to 3 years to rebuild a herd once it has been liquidated. Beef prices are at record highs not because of demand, but because of supply destruction. And the avian influenza outbreak that has ravaged the American poultry flock since 2022 has resulted in the culling of more than 185 million birds, the largest animal disease event in American history. Egg prices remain more than double their 2019 baseline. The protein supply in America, beef, chicken, eggs, is under simultaneous assault from drought, disease, and structural economics that make it unprofitable for small ranchers to continue operating. Farm bankruptcies are soaring and farm debt is hitting a record, and the USDA just lost a fifth of its workforce. Grist reported that farm bankruptcies are soaring and farm debt is set to hit a record high this year. Farmers are being squeezed simultaneously by low commodity crop prices, spiking interest rates, struggles following several successive federal funding cuts, blowback from the president's tariffs on international markets, and stubbornly high costs of energy and fertilizer, among other inputs. The government shutdown that ran for 6 weeks froze financial assistance to farmers during the critical harvesting and crop planting season. Farm loans were not processed. Crop insurance payments were delayed. Conservation program applications were suspended, and the USDA's own research laboratories, which develop new crop varieties, new farming techniques, and new solutions for the diseases and pests that threaten American agriculture, were shuttered. A researcher at the National Center for Agricultural Utilization Research told Grist that it is his lab's job to find new products, new uses, and new solutions for the crops that farmers produce, and that losing a month and a half of work meant that time was not spent working on solutions and implementations to assist farmers. And the shutdown was not the only blow to the USDA. Upward of 20,000 USDA staffers, roughly a fifth of the agency's entire workforce, have lost their jobs this year through the administration's government downsizing initiative. The agency that is supposed to inspect the food supply, process farm loans, administer crop insurance, manage conservation programs, oversee nutrition assistance, and conduct the agricultural research that keeps American farming competitive, has been reduced by 20%. Jenny Brake, a data scientist studying food insecurity and climate change at the University of Colorado, warned that when agencies like the USDA or FDA halt or scale back operations, there are ripple effects through the supply chain because of the effect on crop payments, insurance, inspections, and nutrition programs. Those ripple effects, combined with unpredictable policies, erode public trust and market transparency, weaken support systems, and increase vulnerabilities to shocks like disease outbreaks or extreme climate events. And perhaps the most alarming decision of all is that the Trump administration has announced that after this year, it will no longer issue the annual Household Food Security Report that has been the gold standard for understanding hunger in America for more than 3 decades. The government is not just cutting the programs that feed hungry Americans, it is eliminating the data that measures how many hungry Americans there are. You cannot solve a problem you refuse to count, and the administration has decided to stop counting. And the states with the highest food insecurity rates are the states that voted most heavily for the candidates now cutting the programs. Arkansas at 18.9%. Texas at 16.9%, Louisiana at 16.2%, Oklahoma at 15.4%. And as many as 25% of military families are food insecure, according to Washington Monthly, nearly double the civilian rate. A quarter of the U.S. military cannot feed its own families. And a researcher named Simonova warned that the government shutdown froze financial assistance to farmers during the critical harvesting and crop planting season and has created potential risks to the U.S. food supply chain in 2026 and 2027, and that without adequate financial assistance, the nation's food is on track to become more expensive and more limited in supply. The appropriations bill that ended the shutdown cut more than $75 million from conservation technical assistance programs. The Farm Bill extension removed payment limits for cost-sharing conservation programs. And the $16 billion pool for weather-related aid that the USDA announced it would release is a fraction of the losses that climate events have inflicted on American agriculture in recent years. The government is asking farmers to do more with less money, less water, less staff support, less research, less insurance processing, and less market stability than at any time in the past half-century. And then it expresses surprise when farm bankruptcies soar, when farmland is abandoned, when young people refuse to enter the profession, and when the nation that once fed the world can no longer keep its own grocery shelves stocked at prices its citizens can afford. 47.9 million Americans lived in food-insecure households last year, and the programs that fed them are being gutted. The USDA's December 2025 Household Food Security Report, which may be the last one ever published, revealed that 47.9 million people lived in food-insecure households in 2024. 1 in 7 American households, 13.7%, experienced food insecurity. 14.1 million children lived in those households. More than a third of single-mother households, 36.8%, were food insecure, nearly 2% higher than the previous year. Black households experienced food insecurity at 24.4%, and Hispanic households at 20.2%. Washington Monthly reported that more than 50 million people visited a food bank in 2023, and demand is growing. The Arlington Food Assistance Center in suburban Washington, D.C. now serves an average of 3,850 families per week, an 84% increase over the last 4 years. And the Capital Area Food Bank surveyed approximately 4,000 households in the D.C. metro area and found that 41% of households affected by federal jobs and spending cuts were food insecure as of May. 40% said their household finances had declined, including 36% of households earning between $79,000 and $179,000 and 28% earning more than $180,000. More than half, 55%, said they were buying lower cost, less healthy food to stretch their dollars. The hunger crisis is no longer confined to the poor. It has entered the middle class. It has entered households earning $180,000 per year. And the SNAP program that serves as the first line of defense against hunger is being cut by $295 billion over the next decade, the largest reduction in the program's history. The House Agriculture Committee voted 34-17 in March 2026 to report the farm bill that the Food Research and Action Center described as devastating to SNAP. Work requirements are being expanded to include adults aged 55 to 64 for the first time. Benefits are being reduced. Eligibility barriers are being raised. And FRAC filed a lawsuit in March 2026 challenging USDA waivers that restrict what families can purchase with their SNAP benefits, arguing that the restrictions threaten food choice and dignity. The programs that kept 47.9 million people from going hungry are being systematically dismantled, while the number of people who need them is climbing. And the government has decided to stop measuring how many people are hungry so that the consequences of the dismantling will never be officially documented. The average American farmer is 58 years old, and nobody is replacing them, and the farmland is being bought by corporations and foreign investors. The average age of an American farmer is 58.1 years old, according to the most recent USDA census of agriculture. That is not a temporary demographic blip. That is the culmination of a multi-decade trend in which young people have systematically abandoned farming as a career because the economics no longer work. A young person looking at farming in 2026 sees a profession where the average net farm income does not cover the cost of the equipment needed to operate, where land prices have risen to levels that make entry impossible without family wealth or massive debt, where a single bad growing season can wipe out a decade of accumulated equity, where health insurance costs $2,600 per month for a family, where the nearest hospital is a 45-minute drive and might be closed by the time they get there, and where the government's response to their financial distress is to cut the programs that were supposed to help. The Farm Food and National Security Act of 2026, currently being debated in Congress, includes a provision to create a 10-member commission to study barriers facing retiring and next-generation producers in transitioning land and other assets. The fact that Congress needs a commission to study why young people are not becoming farmers tells you everything you need to know about the scale of the crisis. The barriers are not mysterious. They are obvious. Land is too expensive. Equipment is too expensive. Inputs are too expensive. Commodity prices are too low, federal support is too uncertain, and the lifestyle is too punishing for a generation that watched their parents work 16-hour days and still lose money. And when the 58-year-old farmer retires or dies, the land does not typically pass to a young farmer who wants to grow food. The farmland market is extremely competitive and fast-paced, with land often being purchased in cash by corporations, investment funds, and foreign buyers who see agricultural land as a financial asset, not as a productive farm. Farmers who rely on the Farm Service Agency's ownership loans are at a distinct disadvantage because loan approvals can take months while cash buyers close in days. The result is a steady transfer of American farmland from family farmers who grow food to institutional investors who hold land as a speculative asset. And every acre that transfers from a working farmer to a corporate balance sheet is an acre that may or may not continue producing food, depending on whether the financial return on farming exceeds the financial return on holding the land idle, leasing it for solar panels, or developing it for housing. The decision about whether that acre feeds Americans is no longer being made by a farmer who cares about the land. It is being made by a portfolio manager who cares about the return. And the consolidation of American agriculture into fewer and larger operations has created an efficiency that looks impressive on paper but masks a catastrophic fragility. 4 companies control approximately 85% of American beef processing. 3 companies control roughly 63% of pork processing. 2 companies control approximately 47% of chicken processing. When one processing plant goes offline due to a fire, a contamination event, a labor dispute, or a cyber attack, there is no backup capacity. The entire regional supply of that protein is disrupted because the system was designed for maximum throughput, not for resilience. In 2021, a ransomware attack on JBDS, the world's largest meat processor, shut down operations at plants across the country for days. In 2019, a fire at a Tyson Foods plant in Kansas removed approximately 6% of the nation's beef processing capacity overnight. These are not hypothetical vulnerabilities. They have already been exploited, and the food system has not been redesigned to prevent them from happening again because redesigning the system would reduce the profit margins of the companies that control it. The average grocery store carries approximately 72 hours of food on its shelves at any given time. 3 days of inventory stands between the normal American food supply and visible physical scarcity. That buffer was tested during the pandemic, when panic buying stripped shelves bare in hours. It has not been expanded since, and the just-in-time supply chain that delivers food to those shelves depends on diesel trucks driven by an aging workforce that is struggling to recruit replacements, on railroads that have cut their workforces to the bone, on ports that are vulnerable to weather and labor disruption, and on a highway infrastructure that the American Society of Civil Engineers has rated a C-. Every link in the chain from farm to fork is thinner, more stressed, and more brittle than it has been at any point in the past 50 years. Tariffs are making food more expensive, and the Iran war is making it worse, and the grocery store is where every crisis converges. The Tax Foundation documented that tariffs will affect 75% of U.S. food imports. The total additional tax burden on all goods could add up to $1,300 to $1,600 per household in 2026 alone. Grocery prices are already 29% higher than they were before the pandemic, according to Washington Monthly. Beef prices are at record highs partly because of the 76% tariff on Brazilian beef and partly because drought has forced ranchers to cull their herds to levels not seen since the 1960s. Coffee prices are up 20.9%. Apples are up 9.6%. Bananas are up 6.6%. And the Iran war that began on February 28th has layered an energy price shock on top of the tariff price shock. The March 2026 CPE showed energy prices rising 10.9% in a single month. That energy increase is now cascading through the food supply chain because every step of American food production, from the fertilizer to the tractor to the processing plant to the refrigerated truck to the grocery store shelf, depends on energy that just got dramatically more expensive. The convergence point for every crisis I have described in this video is the grocery store. The water depletion shows up as higher prices for crops that can no longer be irrigated cheaply. The farmland abandonment shows up as reduced domestic supply and increased reliance on imports. The farm bankruptcy show up as fewer producers competing for your business, which means less price competition and higher margins for the survivors. The USDA workforce reduction shows up as slower inspections, delayed crop insurance payments, and reduced research into the diseases and pests that threaten next year's harvest. The SNAP cuts show up as 47.9 million people with less money to spend on food, which sounds like it would reduce demand and lower prices, but actually destabilizes the retail infrastructure because grocery stores in low-income neighborhoods depend on SNAP revenue to stay open. When SNAP is cut, those stores close, creating food deserts where the nearest grocery is a 30-minute drive. The tariffs show up as higher prices on the 75% of food imports they affect. The Iran war shows up as higher energy costs embedded in every food product at every stage of its journey from farm to fork. And the consumer who walks into the grocery store in June or July of 2026 will be facing the combined impact of every one of these forces simultaneously, compressed into a single receipt that tells the story of a country that built the most productive agricultural system in human history and then, through a combination of policy neglect, political convenience, resource depletion, and institutional sabotage, dismantled it in a single generation. Every piece of that dismantling was a choice, the choice to subsidize crops that drain aquifers rather than crops that conserve them. The choice to allow farmland to be converted to subdivisions rather than protecting it with agricultural easements. The choice to consolidate food processing into 4 companies rather than enforcing antitrust laws. The choice to cut the USDA workforce by 20% rather than investing in the agency that protects the food supply. The choice to impose tariffs on food imports without investing in domestic production to replace them. The choice to cut SNAP by $295 billion rather than feeding 47.9 million Americans who are already going hungry. The choice to eliminate the Food Insecurity Report rather than funding the programs that would reduce the numbers it documents. The choice to start a war that sent energy prices through the food chain without any plan to insulate consumers from the consequences. Every crisis in American food in 2026 was chosen by someone, for some reason. And the reason was never to make food more available, more affordable, or more secure for ordinary Americans. The bill for those choices is being paid in skipped meals, in food bank lines that stretch around the block, in children who go to school hungry, in seniors who choose between medication and groceries, and in farmers who cap their wells and walk away from land their grandparents broke with their own hands. America fed the world. Go look at your grocery receipt and tell me what America feeds now. Share this video with every American who buys food. Subscribe and turn on notifications. I will see you in the next one. Because when a country that produced so much food it had to pay farmers not to grow it becomes a country where 1 in 7 households cannot afford to eat, that is not a recession. That is not a cycle. That is a civilizational failure. And civilizational failures do not reverse themselves without the kind of honesty that nobody in Washington is currently willing to provide. And the grocery receipt will keep telling the truth long after the politicians have stopped talking about it.